focus really for this is the God question series. And in the binder, in the forum binder, there is, in the very back of the binder, you will find this paper. It's a single paper on this series called the God question series, Science, God and the Search for Truth. And this is a new, which you may have heard of before. How many of you are familiar, by the way, with the series? Have you heard of it? Some of you have. There is a broadcast series that was broadcast in Sweden in November, I think, in Norway in January, February, and it's now moving into various countries. The topic and so on, yes. Yeah. Anyway, this is a series, and so our forum now, hi, Jay. Our pre-forum now is built on that series, and it's going to introduce it and going to explore the content and see how useful it is, but it's not limited to that series, the value of it. Anyway, this is a 3-part series. It's 3 times 52 minutes, the broadcast version. And then there is a DVD version for use either in schools or in churches. And that is 6 times 30 minutes. It's either 3 times 52 or 6 times 30 minutes. And this is breaking new ground because it is a series which presents a balanced picture of the God debate, of the God and science debate. You may recall some years ago there was this famous book, The Da Vinci Code, which created a lot of interest all around the world in the question of who is Jesus. And of course many Christians thought it was a really bad thing. Well, on the other hand, it was a good thing that the question of who Jesus is was put on the agenda, which really presented an opportunity for us to explore that and to use that. This is the same thing happens quite a few years ago when Richard Dawkins published his book, The God Delusion. Again, the content is in many ways destructive, but again, it puts the question of God on the agenda. God and science, the God question, is now firmly on the agenda. So, some of you may be familiar with that Richard Dawkins made a series, actually he made 3 different series on BBC, and actually BBC gave him the microphone and the camera and said, do whatever you want. At least that was what seemed to have happened if you look at the result. So it was very much a propaganda version for him, on, for example, God and the question of evil, religion as the root of all evil, which was one of the series. So there were a group of Christian people, evangelical, a production company, and some others came together in UK and said, we need to do something about this. And then the result of that was the production of this series. And they decided not to go for the alternative route, to produce a Christian propaganda or argumentative piece, but actually to produce a balanced picture of the debate. So this series is unique because it presents different perspectives, different positions, different arguments, and try to be fair. So it's a documentary trying to be fair according to classical journalistic ideals and perspectives. So I think, before going into this, it's helpful to have what I would say is a 3-fold task that we need to address. As Christians living in a pluralistic culture, in a culture with many different perspectives, competing truth claims, and also living in a culture where the secular thinking is so tremendously influential. It's like presenting who God is not really considered as a possibility even in many contexts. It's ruled out as a possibility even at the outset. So I think we have a 3-fold task here. The first task is to facilitate a public debate that is more balanced. Sometimes we as Christians can actually be facilitators of such a debate to create arenas and structures. There are some arenas in the world where this could happen. You can, by your own participation, contribute to a more balanced debate. There may be a setting like Speaker's Corner in UK, or a setting like the traditional documentary format like this one. Or a public debate. You may have seen a number of public debates between John Lennox and Richard Dawkins, or William Lane Craig and others. And that is something about the same idea that is behind this series. He's tried to contribute to creating a more balanced debate, where those who listen, those who view this, will be able to understand the issues better, understand the arguments better, but the programs themselves don't present the conclusion. It's open to the viewers to draw the conclusions. So it's an open-ended approach where you sort of bring a number of people to the table. And I think the unique thing is that this series brings credible Christian voices to the table. It brings people like John Lennox, William Lane Craig, John Polkinghorne, Francis Collins, and a number of others to the table to contribute alongside atheists, pantheists, agnostics, or whatever. So I think that's our first task in today's pluralistic culture when it comes to these issues, is to facilitate public debate, stimulate that. And sometimes it's our task to help people to engage and understand, and not always only to argue for our own position, but help people to engage, present the issues in a much more broader spectrum and a much more comprehensive way. And then, of course, the second task is to contribute to the public debate. Hello, welcome. And the second task is for some people who has the possibility and the roles of contributing to this debate by being one of the voices that are being drawn to the table. So we need people like John Lennox, who's going to be the plenary speaker this Bible morning, the Bible studies in the morning, which we do look forward to, of course. And someone like William Lane Craig and the others I mentioned. So some of us have the role of facilitating, I think. That may be people who are working as journalists, as documentarians, as people, whether it's, in some culture being a radio show host or a television show host, or, in influential roles where you are a gatekeeper in a public debate setting. And that should not be underemphasized. It's a very important role. But the second role for some people are then to contribute to the debate. The third role is actually to help Christians to understand the issues better. Enable Christians to engage. Many Christians, many evangelicals especially, when it comes to God and science, immediately goes to some questions that are at the top of their minds. And sometimes these questions relate to in-house discussions within the Christian church. So it's, for example, very common to to quickly move to the area of evolution, for example, and to present one position on that, whatever that position may be. But that is not the primary issue. The primary issue is there a God? And so the primary issue is theism or atheism or pantheism. So the primary issue is an issue of worldviews. And then we may, of course, add on the top of that then an implication of that may be to ask, which kind of God are we talking about? Are we talking about, if we choose a theistic position, a God of the Bible, the God of the Quran, the God of whatever? So you see, we need to help Christians to engage at a meaningful level, to distinguish between primary questions and secondary questions, between the public issues of general interest, and the in-house discussions in Christian circles. And also enable Christians to participate at different levels and in different arenas. it may be helpful for you to know something about what we did in Norway when this was broadcast in January and February. Because it was actually broadcast 3 times by the equivalent to BBC, the NRK. And it was almost prime time broadcast. And what we did was that we created a website that was intended to help people to understand the issues better. That was advertised, and it was not advocating a specific Christian position or as a whole website, but it included the debates, included the issues, help people to engage with the programs, to be able to converse, talk to others, stimulate discussion. We got actually quite a lot of good response on that. And then we had another website where we actually pushed the Christian arguments, the perspectives, and directed people to that. If you want to get to know the Christian perspective, in depth, this is where you can find it. So a number of people in Christian churches, for example, found that really helpful. And as I said, the series is then a broadcast series, but it's also a DVD series. And that DVD series is intended to help either on the school arena or on the church arena to engage with these issues in a much more in-depth way. So we hope to publish those DVDs shortly. Finally, before going to engage with the series and the issues itself in those 3 programs, let me conclude this introduction by referring to a very influential document from 2010. It's called the Cape Town Commitment. Some of you may be familiar with the Lausanne movement, which started in 1974 as a global network of evangelical leaders. And this was the first meeting was held in Lausanne in 1974 with John Stott and Billy Graham as the leading personalities, luminaries at that time. And the Lausanne Covenant was very influential as a platform, for example, functioning also indirectly as a platform for ELF here. The Cape Town Commitment, in the foreword there, it says something very significant. It says that the intention of the whole Cape Town Congress, the whole Cape Town Commitment, and by implication then, the intention of us engaging with the global world today as Christians is the challenge to bear witness to Jesus Christ and all his teaching. You may recall the bear witness to expression from John's Gospel. It's a very rich expression talking about that the whole of us are involved as human beings in bearing witness to who Jesus is, the uniqueness of Christ, and to his teaching, everything included in what he taught. So to bear witness about Jesus Christ and all his teaching. And then it adds in 3 dimensions, in 3 different aspects. The first aspects in every nation. So we are called as Christians today to bear witness in every nation globally. That's, the traditional understanding of mission, cross-cultural mission. But also in every sphere of society. And that includes the sphere of science, for example, which we will tackle here today. That includes the sphere of education. That includes the sphere of media, and so on and so on. And as Christians, we have often underestimated the importance of bearing witness, not just in the church context as such, but equipping Christians to bear witness to Jesus Christ in every sphere of society. And then thirdly, the third dimension, and in the realm of ideas. So we are called to bear witness to Jesus Christ and all his teaching, also in the realm of ideas. That means where ideas are shaped. And where does that happen today? Well, it happens in this educational system, it happens in the media system, and in the intersection of that. And of course, in the family context, in the church context, and all that. So I think this is a very crucial challenge to all of us. We are called to bear witness to the whole richness of who Jesus is, he who is claimed to be the Word, by him the whole world was created. In him everything is kept together, held together. And we are called to bear witness to him globally, in every sector of society, including the area of science, and then in the realm of ideas. So have that as a background to what we're going to talk about. This is the task that we have, to bear witness to Jesus and all his teaching and all that implies. Let's pray together.
Because in a sense what we're going to do today will give you a slightly unbalanced view of the series. Because coming at this as someone who's engaged in the area of philosophy and apologetics generally, who's contributing to that public debate and wanting to encourage my fellow Christians with the fascinating information and arguments that are in this area, in putting together a sort of guided tour through the series, some very long clips and various shorter clips and so on, and diving behind the conversation that it's presenting there to kind of show you how you could move beyond the balanced picture that the series presents to actually engaging in the arguments and how the Christian side of this has the better of the arguments. That will inevitably mean that I'm sort of unbalancing what the TV program does. So I thought it was worthwhile re-emphasizing that. I hope you'll see as we'll go through the quality of the presentation in the series. It really is just a world-class presentation that you don't need to have any worries about it seeming like a sort of back-of-the-van operation, as it were. So I apologise if at any stage the limitations of my laptop's graphic card mean that some of the clips get a little bit juddery, but it's really well produced, aesthetically speaking. This is a good piece of documentary making, as well as the sheer fascination of the actual content, the number of well-known talking heads from across a range of positions that they have. And also, when it comes to the teaching DVD that splits each of the programs into two, so it's a sort of half-hour session that you could fit into a small group church setting or a community discussion group kind of setting. They've done a very interesting thing with the program by putting color-coded chapter headings, and you'll probably notice occasionally in some of the clips a sort of color dot appearing in the screen. And that's a colour dot that relates to a booklet that they've produced, really nicely produced booklet, whereby you can go in at particular chapters to look at particular issues. Here it is. My lovely assistant is showing it off here. And they have discussion questions and quotations from the series and so on to help you guide group discussion on it. And actually, whenever there's a talking head that appears on the show, they get that little strap line, Professor so-and-so, physicist at Caltech or whatever. Those are colour-coded as well to let you know whether they're coming at the issue as an atheist or as a theist, or from a sort of position of neutrality. They're just there to give you a bit of information within the show. And many of those are agnostics, I think. But if they're specifically coming at the issue as, Peter Atkins, atheist, or William Lane Craig, theist, the colour coding lets you know their position in quite a subtle way. I think that's a really nice feature that they've built into it. So, am I okay here if I stand for the video at this side of the... I'm just making sure I'm not out of shot and things. The God question covers science, God and the search for truth, it is subtitled. And science, well, we could spend a whole fascinating conference on debating how do we understand what science is. Let me step in where angels fear to tread and just suggest that we think of science as a fallible discipline. That's important to say. All human disciplines, science and theology indeed, are fallible human disciplines. Science is the fallible human discipline that's seeking to understand the truth about observable reality. And when you do that, it very quickly leads you away from immediately observable reality and towards sort of indirectly observable reality. And by the time you're getting into questions of cosmology and so on, the difference between are we doing science or are we doing philosophy, you could stick a piece of paper between them. Not surprisingly, since, of course, scientists have only had the name for a couple of hundred years. Science used to be part of philosophy. It was natural philosophy, but it gradually moved away out of the philosophy departments into their own departments in the university settings. There is a primary focus in this series, not only on the balanced presentation of the discussion today, but on what you might call mainstream science. The series is more concerned to say, what does mainstream science tell us about our world? And then how do different people from different worldviews interpret that information as fitting or not fitting with different understandings of the world, religiously speaking? There are moments within the programme where it gets more into the details of controversial issues and gives a voice to minority positions, such as creationist positions or intelligent design positions within the sciences. But that's not its main focus, as it were. And that's just the way that they've decided to focus on the philosophical issue, which is, again, this difference between the primary issues and the secondary issues. The philosophical issue of actually, it's not that science directly tells us what worldview to have. It's that people do science and then they think philosophically about it in terms of their worldviews. It's much more that way around, generally speaking, that things happen. So the search for truth brings in the necessity of philosophy in Thomas Aquinas famously said that science was, that theology was the queen of the sciences, assisted by her handmaiden philosophy. And philosophy sort of acts as a handmaiden here as well, in terms of the relationship between science and theology, or a-theology from the other side. So, without going into the details of what it's talking about there, it's just, I wanted to show that clip at the beginning because it's interesting that the program itself highlights the fact that science, although that's the whole focus of the program, science is not the royal road to reality, as it were, and that there is a sense in which we have to remember that our interpretation of what the science is telling us is at least as much influenced by our philosophical understanding of things as it is by what the science is telling us. And we put those together, and different people of different positions put them together in different ways. So I thought it was nice that they had just a little bit in the first program of various people saying, science is great and it's important, and we want to incorporate what science tells us about reality into our understanding of things. But when we do that, we necessarily end up thinking at a philosophical level as well. So that's the necessity of philosophy, although it's science and the God question, science, God, and the search for truth. Let's have a fairly long clip from Programme 1, and we'll focus mostly on Programme 1, and we hopefully have time to get on to 2 and 3, but we'll speed up as we go through, as it were. But perhaps that's because Programme 1 had the most issues that fascinated me personally. So.
As we said, the first program focuses on the cosmos, on the question of mainstream science. What are the views in mainstream science? And we heard something about Big Bang, about being the most established theory about the origin of the cosmos. And then 3 key questions come up. And I think all those questions, those 3, needs to be really focused on and reflected on. The first question is, why is there something rather than nothing? It's an age-old question, of course, a question from the history of philosophy and theology. But it's really worth asking the question because, and bringing the question into discussion with people, into conversations with people, because it is a very profound question. Why is there something rather than nothing? And that, of course, relates to meaning of the universe, meaning of life, ultimate meaning. And the question is then, how do different worldviews answer that question? That's the very important thing to reflect on. Secondly, the universe is temporarily finite in the past. So there is a beginning of the universe. One of the major implications of the Big Bang theory, the whole Big Bang scientific theory, is that the universe started at one point in time. Time and space has a beginning, a definite temporary beginning. If you think along time as one dimension and space as another, there is one point when this started all. The very beginning. We heard about the 31st seconds and the 3 first minutes and so on in this clip just a couple of minutes ago. What does that imply? Well, of course, it's a very interesting question to ask. What does that imply for atheism? If everything started once, and atheism is struggling today to try to answer that question. And thirdly, does the fine-tuning of the universe point to a fine-tuner? I don't know if you have read some of the new atheists' material, but it's interesting that some of them, maybe all of them, actually claim that there is an appearance of fine-tuning. It seems to be fine-tuned. Like, the title The Blind Watchmaker by Dawkins, was it? So it's an acknowledgement that there seems to be a pattern there. There seems to be a fine-tuning. But it may be only an illusion. So, here are 3 fundamental questions. Why is the universe there at all? Is it self-explanatory in itself, or does it, by its existence, point beyond itself? Does it raise the question of meaning by existing? And we mustn't underestimate, I think, the power of that question. Secondly, the finiteness of it all, the beginning of it. And I think it's important for all of us to take home that. According to mainstream science, the Big Bang understanding, that theory is very, thoroughly established, and it creates real difficulties for an atheist understanding of reality. And then thirdly, we talked about the fine-tuning. Let's go to the atheist response. People like Atkins and Krauss says something can come out of nothing. Really? Well, they claim that. That's their understanding of reality. That actually nothing is the explanation of the something. That why is there anything rather than nothing? Well, because there was nothing before, and that nothingness in some way explains everything. And there are different ways of phrasing this, of explaining this, and we may come back to that. But still, that's a fundamental understanding. Secondly, they claim that quantum mechanics shows that the first event, that is the Big Bang, could have happened without a cause. It's an understanding of the first condition of the whole universe could be explained through the mechanics of quantum mechanics, through that mechanism, that in some way or another, that could actually, by itself, create the universe that we see today. So it's appealing to the mechanism of quantum mechanics, almost in a mysterious way, it seems. Thirdly, we are actually the winners of a cosmic lottery. The specificity of the cosmic fine-tuning is a chance consequence or being winners in a cosmic lottery. Either we were very lucky, which of course then we are, winners of a lottery, very lucky, or we postulate an alternative explanation, which you may have heard of, the so-called multiverse, that there is just not one universe, there is a number of possible universes. And then you add, an almost infinite number of universes, and that seems to be the explanation. Okay, if there are an infinite number, or at least a very large number, why should there be a universe like ours among those with life-permitting existence? So you see, there is something here about how do we respond to these questions. Okay then, how is the classical theist response like the Christian theism? Well, first of all, that the existence of something rather than nothing is consistent with the classical Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. And we could go to John 1 or Colossians 1 or Hebrews 1 as well. Very important passages. And that is by a necessary being. That is, God exists by necessity. Have you noticed the little phrase in John's Gospel where Jesus says that as the Father exists, as the Father has life in himself, so he has given to me to have life in myself. So only God is self-existent. All of us are dependent on him. And that's, of course, going back to one type of cosmological arguments. There are different types, and this is the so-called Leibnizian type. Secondly, if the universe had a beginning once, the temporal finiteness of the universe, it has a beginning at one point, it does suggest then that there is a transcendent cause, a cause outside the universe. And this then corresponds to the argument presented especially by someone like William Lane Craig, called the Kalam argument. That talking about that if the universe started to exist, began to exist, and everything that begins to exist has a cause, then the universe must have a cause. And then thirdly, the whole area of fine-tuning being a very strong indicator that there is supernatural intelligence involved, that there is someone who has deliberately designed the whole universe to be compatible with life, to be life-permitting. So do you see the force of these questions, the force of these arguments? And this is just trying to be fair to the atheist and the theist position. And it goes back to these three fundamental questions. So I think it's very important that we understand the stark contrast here between the atheist and the theist position. And sometimes it seems as if Christians many Christians in churches they haven't really engaged with the stark difference here. They haven't really put themselves in the shoes of an atheist and tried to answer the question without God. Because we are, for us it's sort of almost self-evident that God is there and God has created.
One slide on the Leibnizian cosmological argument, particularly like this, but I thought I'd stick the hardest bit of philosophy in at the beginning, and then it's all downhill from there on. So that's all right, isn't it? That's the good news. All of these kind of arguments that work with this question, why is there something rather than nothing? The very question, you're asking for an explanation. It's about when do we need an explanation of things? And going back to the philosopher Leibniz, German philosopher that this argument's named after, various versions of this so-called principle of sufficient reason. When you explain something, you need to explain it in terms of something that has has enough resources to do the explaining that's needed, that has the wherewithal to explain the thing that you're explaining. Here we've put the principle that everything that exists has an explanation of why it exists. But there could be two ways of explaining why something exists. It's either in the necessity of its own nature. You could say it's the kind of thing that's able to exist without having to have an explanation outside of itself. It doesn't depend on anything outside of itself. It can just exist. Maybe that's possible. On the other hand, it could be because of something external to it. It exists, but only because it has been caused, or its existence is explained by something outside of itself. And those seem to be the two possible ways in which the existence of a thing could be explained. It's explained by something outside of itself, or it's explained by its own nature. Now, given that if everything that exists has an explanation, either in its nature or due to something outside of its nature, premise 2 here is simply that the universe exists. That's pretty hard to deny. Okay? That's quite a secure premise there. From those, it would follow that the universe does have an explanation of its existence. It's here, it clearly raises the question. Seems a sensible question to ask, therefore. So if the universe has an explanation of its existence, this is going to be the crucial premise, really. This is going to be where the atheist is going to go, hang on a minute, because we want to claim that that explanation would be God. What you're really saying is that if the universe has an explanation of its existence, it's not in terms of its own nature. The universe seems to be the kind of thing that needs an explanation outside of itself. Certainly all of the individual things that make up the universe seem to be the kind of things that have explanations outside of themselves, as it were. Now, if that is true, this is a good argument for God. So what they're really going to question, if anything, is why think that if the universe has an explanation, then that explanation is God. But that's simply really the reverse of what atheists have traditionally said, that in an atheistic worldview, that if there is no God to explain the universe, then the universe must explain itself, because there isn't anything outside of the universe to appeal to explain it. So it would have to explain itself. So actually the real question is the universe the kind of thing whose nature contains the resources to explain its own existence just by thinking about the universe, or not? Or is it the kind of thing that by its nature does seem to point outside of itself? Because universes don't exist by a necessity of their own nature. And my favourite way to point this out is that often when you're talking about the fine-tuning argument with atheists, they want to go to a multiverse escape hatch, which means saying, well, maybe there is, some sort of inflationary cosmology wherein there are lots of universes popping into existence with randomly different laws. They're all different from each other. Universes don't have to be the same, and they can pop into existence, be generated by some sort of field universe generating mechanism. And there's so many of those pop into existence that by random you'd expect one that's tuned in the way that is permitting life to exist. But to take that escape hatch is to think of universes as things that can be different, that vary, that can come into existence, that can be caused. To think of universes as the kind of things that are not what they are by a necessity of their own nature. that don't exist by a necessity of their own nature. So even if the atheists wanted to, put their feet down in the face of this kind of cosmological argument and say, no, I'm going to say that the universe it exists by a necessity of its own nature. Well, then, when we come on to the fine-tuning argument, they're going to be in an even harder bind. Because if they want to then use the multiverse escape hatch, we can show them the contradiction within their position there. So just like in chess, where you can get your knight in the position to, I'm either going to take that pawn, or if you move it and protect it, I'm going to take that one. You're going to lose one way or the other. I've got you in a classic chess fork. You can get a classic kind of philosophical fork between a cosmological argument like this and the fine-tuning argument, such that even if the atheist really wants to say what seems to me very implausible to say, that universes are the kind of thing that exist by a necessity of their own nature, rather than being contingent and so on. Well, even if they go that route, then they're just making, a rod for their own back when we come on to one of the other arguments, which I think is the way of framing the discussion, steering the discussion, having that in the back of your mind. It's like, okay, you can say that here, yeah. Just you wait till we come on to this other argument. And then do you want to backpedal here? Oh, okay. Oh, now you want to say that there are lots of universes can pop into existence. They're contingent. Okay. Let me just remind you what you said back here. You see? I think that's quite fun. So that's the most difficult philosophical bit. It's downhill from here. Any brief questions on that? But we'll get back to the more purely scientific-y stuff from here on in. Now, this is British Oxford chemist Peter Atkins, who's one of the new atheists. And you may not have caught that in passing, but he really did say that the universe may just be an instance of nothing transforming itself into something that seems to exist. So actually, Peter Atkins' answer to the question, why is there something than nothing? Actually, his answer is to say, well, there isn't something rather than nothing. Nothing exists. It just seems like something exists, and that's just a rearrangement, he says, an interesting rearrangement of nothing. It makes no conceptual sense at all, but the way he would kind of justify saying that in a sort of pseudo-scientific way sometimes is to talk about the way in which the certain energies in the universe that you can measure have a balancing force, an opposing force to them. And that when you do the mathematical sum of the opposing equally balanced physical forces, the resulting product of the sum, because they're equal opposing physical forces, is zero. Oh, nothing. So this positive force balancing out this negative physical force equals nothing. Now that's just a play on the word nothing. He's just being ambiguous about nothing. And even just showing a clip like that with such a range of views and balance in a service or a youth meeting or something, just to raise the question. There are lots of different questions raised in there. Does the universe need a cause? Does the Big Bang imply a cause? If you say God did it, then why can't I just ask who made God? Well, as again, John Lennox, to reference him again, said if Richard Dawkins had written a book called The Created God Delusion, he thinks the book probably wouldn't have sold as many copies, because we know that created gods are delusions by definitions, they're idols. To dismiss from the table in advance of discussion the possibility of an uncreated creator, which is what the theistic tradition has always considered God's nature to be that which has an explanation of its own existence in its own nature, rather than outside of itself, as they were saying there in that clip, is to beg the question. But I thought one of the really interesting quotes in there is from Steven Weinberg, the atheist, says this about science. Science is looking for non-theistic explanations of what we see in nature. That's a philosophical expression of a particular philosophy of science, which he calls on to justify in the face of the evidence, saying, give us time, wait, this promissory naturalism that we've talked about. We will find a non-theistic answer, and why should we wait for that rather than dealing with the evidence that we actually have? Well, because the whole point of science is looking for non-theistic explanations of what we see. It's a definition of science called methodological naturalism. Now, methodological naturalism is different from naturalism as the claim that nature is all there is. It's not claiming that naturalism is true, exactly, but what it is claiming is that when you do science, you should do science as if naturalism were true. But actually, you can see how that's a very biased definition of science that most philosophers of science today reject. And here's just one quote from the agnostic philosopher of science, Michael Roos, American agnostic philosopher of science, who said it would indeed be very odd were I and others to simply characterize science as something which by definition is based on methodological naturalism, naturalistic philosophy, and hence excludes God by definition. So there would be plenty of non-theistic philosophers of science who would disagree with Steven Weinberg's particular philosophy of science says. And another atheist philosopher of science called Bradley Monton, who's written a little book called Seeking God in Science. And Bradley Monton makes the point, as an atheist philosopher of science, he says, I think methodological naturalism is a bad way of characterizing what science is about, because it means that science is not the search for the truth anymore. It says rather it means science is the search for the best explanation we can come up with that fits with the philosophical precondition that whatever explanation we come up with must at least be consistent with a naturalistic worldview. And he says, well, that philosophy of science, okay, that won't lead you astray if naturalism as a worldview is true. But what if it's not? Maybe science should be about going in search of the truth on the basis of the evidence rather than having made up your mind on a certain view of what has to be true before you go and look. And so there are atheist and agnostic philosophers of science who would differ with Weinberg there, but again, plenty of scientists and philosophers of science, some still perhaps, who would go with that kind of view. But just a little bit that just opens up a whole discussion about what do we mean by science and the role, again, that, as we were saying, that philosophy actually takes place within this. Do we allow the evidence of Big Bang or fine-tuning to point us towards what seems to be the obvious implication of the evidence we have, or do we say, das ist verboten, just by definition, we can't go there, therefore, if you want to talk about that, go to the theology department, go down the pub with the philosopher. It's an interesting issue. The question that's raised, I have to repeat this, is about the difference between doing sort of experimental science on the assumption that you're going to be studying nature as it normally works by its own resources and that miracles aren't going to be mucking up your experiment, as it were, between doing that and then coming on to questions of having done my observations and experiments, thinking about what's the best explanation of our scientific data. And actually, there's an interesting distinction that some philosophers of science will draw between what's called process science, which is science about understanding the nature and orderly processes that go on moment by moment within the physical world, and origins science, which are more closely aligned to the historical science and the historical methodology, where you're asking what is the best explanation for a set of data. And that, yes, I think you're right that methodological naturalism is particularly a difficulty for the historical sciences, more so than for the process sciences, where the question is, even from a theistic point of view, the question is, how does the nature that God has created do its thing according to its powers and processes when there is no additional input, as it were, versus asking a historical question where at least the possibility of additional input on top of that creative processes of the world has to be open. And it's interesting to see that even agnostic and atheist philosophers of science saying we should at least be open to that question and adjudicate them on the basis of, well, is there enough evidence for theistic explanations or design explanations, rather than making up your mind beforehand. So, yeah. I think as Alvin Plantinga said, Christians can be very open-minded and relaxed about what science tells us about the world, because as we've seen with this fundamental underlying question of why even something rather than nothing, the way in which philosophy affects people's interpretation of the science. At most, the science is going to be telling us about the details of how God has arranged and or went about creating his world. It's not actually, science in and of itself is not going to get us to this meta question of why there is a world. But science itself throws up these kind of philosophical questions, and as Bill Craig says, even gives us scientific evidence for premises in arguments of natural theology for the existence of God, arguments like the Kalam cosmological argument. Bradley Monton, who I mentioned a little earlier, atheist philosopher of science, says that if the universe had a beginning, then that lends support to the Kalam cosmological argument. But then an atheist cosmologist like Alexander Vilenkin said recently at the conference honouring Stephen Hawking at his 70th birthday, he said, all the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning. That's a very strong statement from a scientist. He's not saying, on balance, the evidence points towards this conclusion. So all the evidence we have points towards the fact that the universe had a beginning. And there was a commentary in New Scientist magazine, which is not exactly known for its theistic bias, shall we say, saying that physicists have been trying to get around the Big Bang's implication of a beginning for a long time, but that all these attempts to avoid a real beginning have now failed, and it seems certain that there really was a beginning, and without an escape clause, this editorial says at the end there, without an escape clause, physicists and philosophers must finally answer the problem that's been nagging at them for the best part of 50 years. How do you get a universe complete with the laws of physics out of nothing at the beginning? Yes, David. Great question. This question is, can laws of physics exist without matter to operate upon or to describe? Yeah. So I think many would say, I had a fascinating talk in Bulgaria the other evening, Richard talking about the laws of physics and saying that the laws of physics describe how matter behaves, but mathematical equations don't cause anything. And even if you thought mathematical equations can exist independently of a physical universe, if you're some sort of Platonist about maths, by definition, how do abstract Platonic objects do creative work? Most philosophers would say that by definition an abstract object is one that has no causal relations. The number 7 has never caused anything. You'll certainly never stub your toe against it, but it's never caused anything. It's not the kind of thing that does causality. You need an agent, some kind of agent, to produce effect. C.S. Lewis said some interesting things about that as well. So, thinking about a game of snooker and so on, and says it can be all described by Newtonian laws of motion and so on, but the Newtonian laws of motion don't pot balls into holes. For that, you need a person with a cue. And I think that's a really nice analogy to kind of bring that out. So just before we go to coffee break, let me run through my favourite way of putting the Kalam cosmological argument. I think there are good philosophical arguments for thinking there was a beginning as well, but certainly modern cosmology seems to very powerfully accept that the Big Bang Theory, that there was a beginning. Now that immediately entails that in the sequence of physical events that make up physical reality, however many of them there was a first one. There was a first physical event. Physical event number one. But surely the reasonable thing to say about physical events is that they are the kind of thing that has a cause. Reference to our experience of reality, physical events are the kind of things that have a cause outside of themselves, at least in a general sense of causation. They depend upon, are caused by something independent of themselves that exists outside of themselves. Now, if people want to question this premise, they'll usually do it by, we've mentioned it already, punting to quantum mechanics. And then that is in itself confusing one-to-one certain causation with probabilistic causation. It's not that the atoms pop into existence for no reason at all, with no explanation, because you still have the whole baggage of quantum mechanics there, a pre-existing quantum mechanical field out of which these particles pop. Atheist quantum mechanic expert David Alberts puts it this way. This is quite a nice analogy again. He says, the fact that particles can apparently pop into existence out of the quantum vacuum is in a sense no less mysterious than the fact that if I were wiggling my fingers around randomly, sometimes a fist pops into existence. That some of the arrangements of the fields represent particles, or some of the arrangements of my fingers represent fists. They can pop out of existence as I continue randomly wiggling my fingers about the place. My fist doesn't pop into existence out of nothing, with no explanation or cause. Exactly, you have to have the wiggling fingers already there. The particle doesn't literally come into existence from nothing in quantum mechanics. You have to have quantum mechanics in the fields and a whole host of physically described energy and things in order for those particles to pop into existence with, on some interpretations of quantum mechanics, a probabilistic causation rather than a one-to-one causation, but even that is questioned within different interpretations of quantum mechanics. So, and again, punt to a non-biased source. Here is an atheist saying, some people like this get-out clause, but really it doesn't make any sense. So it seems to follow that if there were a first physical event, and every physical event had causes, that the first one would have a cause. And of course, if the first physical event has a cause, what kind of cause could that possibly be? It couldn't possibly be the previous physical one. There isn't a previous physical cause to the first physical event. So it would have to be the non-physical cause, because that's the only remaining alternative. So there's quite a range, again, this emphasis on a range of views, and saying, no, what they're saying there, that there's the generally accepted scientific story of evolution, and that for some, that has become a major plank in an atheistic worldview. Because, as Richard Dawkins says, that at least seems to give you an answer to a nagging, difficult question that you otherwise have of where did all of this apparent design come from? So Richard Dawkins even describes biology as the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed. It says now we have Darwinian evolution to explain away that appearance. On the other hand, say many people are convinced of the generally accepted evolutionary story, but find ways of incorporating that within a Christian worldview and theology. On the other hand, there are people who question more or less of the evolutionary story for various different reasons. Some, again, mentioning of young Earth creationist position, and actually the documentary also gives a fair amount of time to the overlapping but broader position of intelligent design theory. And it's actually interesting to note, and I'll just reference, I'm giving a talk later on in this week in the Apologists track about the waning of naturalism, and noting the number of naturalistic scientists and philosophers of science today who are beginning to question some elements of the evolutionary story, in particular whether the Darwinian mutation and natural selection process as an explanation for the diversity of life is an adequate, a sufficient explanation. And we're living in interesting times with regard to that part of the story, at least, being questioned more and more by secular scientists today. So again, it just puts out on the table there that there is a wide range of views, and that actually different philosophies try and incorporate that mainstream science within themselves, but also there are some, and indeed I would say some from both sides, as it were, who question the mainstream science. So there's a lot of different ways of approaching the subject and opening up the conversation. That's quite an interesting take on what Darwin was about doing from one of his biographers there being interviewed. Seeing Darwin as following in the footsteps of people like Newton and so on, in looking for laws of nature, but in this case, laws of nature that govern the biological world. And Darwin's certainly had questions and doubts and problems with Christianity and with the belief in God as his life went on. But as biographers these days recognise, that actually had more to do with his experience of suffering, losing children in his life very early on and so on, and that the question of suffering was one that weighed very heavily with him. But it's not that he saw himself a contradiction between discovering laws of nature that explained biological diversity and thinking that there was a God who had instituted that process of law that he thought he had discovered. Now, of course, Darwin goes from these observations of variation in, say, the size of finch beaks as you get dry seasons and wet seasons and so on, and makes an extrapolation to form his theory. He extrapolates and says maybe this observed process of variation, given enough time, assuming there are no in principle barriers that would come up to the extrapolation that we're making, that we could explain all of biological diversity by reference to secondary causes, which you could see as instituted by God. And that is, of course, the way that many theists, many Christians today view the theory. But you see how it opens up, because it's not referencing God directly. It opens up the possibility of the person who doesn't believe in God thinking, aha, this gives us an answer to the question that we otherwise had of, given I don't think there's a God to explain all this diversity, and it sure looks like the product of design, I have a sort of explanatory blank in my worldview. I can now say, thank you very much, Darwin. I'm going to take your theory, which may be consistent with a God, but that means it's also consistent with a not a God view of things, and therefore it becomes an important plank, an explanatory plank in an atheistic worldview. But that in itself doesn't mean that it is necessarily by its own nature a sort of anti-theistic view, as it were. And so that's sort of the programme covering the way in which, again, you have a scientific theory and different theological or atheological views of the world appropriating or fitting themselves around that theory. I've got a slide here making what I think is the important point that modern evolutionary neo-Darwinian theory is what some have called the grand evolutionary story, is actually a hypothesis made up of a number of different suggestions, a number of different ideas about reality, some of which go hand in hand, but some of which don't necessarily go hand in hand. And you will find today a range of people who believe or disbelieve in different elements of this grand evolutionary story, including non-believing atheist agnostic scientists, thinkers, question certain elements of the traditional story. So you might start with what's called the ancient Earth hypothesis, because Darwin said, I observe a certain amount of change can happen in a limited amount of time. In order to explain this huge amount of variety, you need to have a long amount of time. So the theory seems to go hand in hand with thinking there is a long period of time for those natural forces to work within. The progress hypothesis is really sort of the observation that over time life seems to have changed from relatively, and I emphasize relatively, simple forms of life to a greater diversity of more complicated forms of life. The common ancestry hypothesis is the idea that just as I am related to my parents and they're related to their parents, that every existing life form is related by common ancestry to previous different life forms, that they've changed over time from being one life form to the production of new life forms related back to a common ancestor. But that's not quite the same thing as the idea of universal common ancestry, which is the idea that life originated at only one place, and from that one beginning of life, all the diversity is related by common ancestry. So that every existent form of life, every form of life that there has been, goes back to a single common ancestor. And there are a number of atheistic philosophers and scientists who question that idea today. They believe in common ancestry, but not universal common ancestry. They may say that some different basic forms of life, and even Darwin, when he was putting forward the theory, said that life goes back to one or a few different basic forms of life. And that still seems to be a somewhat open question today. The really revolutionary thing that Darwin brings to the table is what some have called the blind watchmaker, to quote Richard Dawkins, the blind watchmaker hypothesis. This is a suggestion of a material engine or naturalistic explanation for the diversity of commonly ancestor-related life over time. That this macro-evolutionary story of diversity over time is driven by the mechanism observed within, say, the change of beak finches, finch beaks and so on, but extrapolated over large amounts of time. But that extrapolation is secure, and then that process is sufficient to explain much greater diversity than we ever see on the lab bench, as it were. And finally, the naturalistic origins hypothesis, which, strictly speaking, is not part of evolutionary theory. To talk about evolution of life, you need to have some kind of life capable of undergoing evolution, that is, capable of reproduction with variation so that it can be affected by natural selection to evolve. And so when you're talking about, well, how do you get life in the first place, you're not, strictly speaking, talking about something that comes under evolutionary theory, even though scientists will talk about it under, say, the rubric of chemical evolution, the origin of life studies. But the question of how do you get something capable of being made more complex by a process of variation and natural selection is not one that you can answer by pointing to a process of variation and natural selection. That would be begging. You've got to get step one there before you can then enter into the rest of the story. And it's perfectly possible to accept some of these hypotheses whilst rejecting other ones. But you can see some are implied by others, but some you could doubt whilst accepting others. So as I said, there are some atheist scientists who doubt universal common ancestry, but accept everything else on the list. It would be possible to reject the naturalistic origins hypothesis and think that the origin of life was a miracle, whilst accepting everything else on the list. Or to accept these points, but doubt these points, and so on. And so the conversation, when you point out that, you see why it is much more complicated than the question, do you believe in evolution or not? It's like, well, which bit of it? That's a sort of have you stopped beating your wife yet question, as a lawyer might put it. This is Alvin Plantinga, a Christian philosopher from the States, his personal take. He says he thinks there's excellent evidence for an ancient Earth. And given the strength of this evidence, one would need powerful evidence on the other side from scriptural considerations in order to hold sensibly that the Earth is young. And he doubts that such scriptural evidence exists. Of course, other Christians think that it does. Plantinga says there's less evidence, but still good evidence in the fossil record for the progress thesis. The claim that there were bacteria before fish, fish before reptiles, reptiles before mammals, and so on. But when he comes to the naturalistic origins thesis, he says it seems to me to be for the most part mere arrogant bluster. I believe it's vastly less probable on our present evidence than its denial. So there you see someone thinking through the issue, and again, from that Christian viewpoint, saying I can be open about what's the science saying, I balance that against my other sources of knowledge, how do I interpret what Scripture's saying, I try and put my sources of knowledge together in the best way that I can, given the present evidence, and that leads me to doubt some elements of the grand evolutionary story, but to accept others. And so the question is more complicated than, do I accept evolution or not? So there again, you start seeing another distinction that could be drawn between saying, when you're talking about random variations that natural selection works upon, what do you mean by, it depends what you mean by random. Perfectly possible to say with Bill Craig there, maybe some or all of those mutations were miraculously caused or intended somehow, guided by God. To say that they weren't wouldn't be so much a scientific assertion as a philosophical assertion that naturalism was true. So there's a difference between an evolutionary theory that says purely metaphysically naturalistic forces full stop are at work here, and a theory that says there are natural forces at work here and they were created by God, but God lets the natural forces do all of the work, and a theory that says God created a whole lot of natural forces and at least maybe some or a lot of the time or all the time guided certain of those natural forces. Did he guide them in a way that we could scientifically detect, like talking about we can detect a healing miracle scientifically, as we were earlier? Well, the question as to yes or no there starts you getting in towards the difference between one form of theistic evolution and intelligent design theory. Because intelligent design theory claims that there's scientific evidence of intelligent causation that you can scientifically detect within the world. But there's actually quite a sort of range of theistic evolution itself. It's not just one possible view. There are those who have a view almost, it's almost the atheistic view, but it's not atheistic because they say God created those processes, he upholds those processes. It's not even a deistic view. Those processes wouldn't exist if God didn't have them there. God intended them, and maybe he's guiding them in a way that's scientifically undetectable. That's another thing you could say. Is this intelligent input, if it's there, detectable, then you're into the realm of intelligent design theory. So there's, again, a breadth to the range of views that are being presented that is not often mentioned within the public conversation. Here's an interesting quote from a very recent British publication by a well-known British atheist philosopher called Mary Midgley in her book, Are You an Illusion? She says this: the idea of natural selection, which is usually called into account for this vast creative surge, is already looking increasingly inadequate to explain evolution. Natural selection is only a filter, and filters do not provide the taste of the coffee that pours through them. Similarly, the range of evolutionary alternatives between which selection takes place has to be there already in matter. You're appealing to matter to have the resources to produce the variations that can be selected. How that variation comes to be present there is the real mystery about creation. Fascinating to see that from an atheist British philosopher. Or in their recent book, What Darwin Got Wrong, atheist philosopher of mind and an atheist biologist, Joe Fodor and Massimo Piatelli-Palmarini, if I've pronounced that correctly, say this: Darwin's theory of natural selection is fatally flawed. We don't know what the mechanism of evolution is. As far as we can make out, nobody knows exactly how phenotypes, that is, different kinds of creature, basically evolve. And they're very clear up front in the preface of their book. They're a little bit nervous about publishing this, and indeed they got heavily criticised by some atheists for doing so, because they say, look, we want to make it clear at the outset that we are atheists, we are materialists, we are committed to having some sort of materialistic, non-design, non-God, non-supernatural explanation for the variety of life. And we accept that evolution, in that sense of progress over time in terms of complexity of creatures, common ancestry, we accept all that. But the thing that we're questioning is the sufficiency of our current material explanations of that variety coming about. Now, yes, these kind of voices are in the minority, but it is interesting to note that I think there are a growing minority of even atheistic thinkers, philosophers and scientists questioning that element of the grand evolutionary story that we looked at. So it's not simply that certain people with a theistic bias, because they understand Genesis in a certain way or whatever, are so blinded by their religious impulses that they are determined to question science and what science says. Another very interesting atheist publication of recent years was Thomas Nagel's book, Mind and Cosmos. He's famous particularly within the philosophy of mind in America. But notice the subtitle of his book. This is published by Oxford University Press, Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False, which is a surprising word to find at the end of that sentence from an atheist philosopher. And he says that the dominant scientific consensus, recognizing that it is the dominant consensus, faces problems of probability that I believe are not taken seriously enough, both with respect to the evolution of life forms through accidental mutation and natural selection, and with respect to the formation from dead matter of physical systems capable of such evolution. The more we learn about the intricacy of the genetic code and its control of the chemical processes of life, the harder those problems seem to be. So he's saying it's one of those gaps that seems to be opening, like John Lennox talks about. The coming into existence of the genetic code seems particularly resistant to being revealed as probable given physical law alone. This is an issue that actually, when Anthony Flew, probably the most famous British atheist of the 20th century, next to A.J. Ayer, when Anthony Flew, later on in life, decided that the incoming evidence of contemporary science, he needed to allow that evidence to push him over from a belief in atheism to a belief in a philosophical theism. He didn't convert to Christianity, he didn't believe in revelation, he didn't believe in life after death. He was very certain on these things, but he said, the more that was discovered about the richness and inherent intelligence of life, the less it seemed likely that a chemical soup could magically generate the genetic code. The difference between life and non-life, it became apparent to me, was ontological. It was about the nature of the kind of arrangement, particularly what Lennox was there saying about its information. It's a particular kind of complexity. It's not just that it's complex, but it's this kind of complexity of information, and not just chemical. The best confirmation of this radical gulf is Richard Dawkins' comical effort to argue in The God Delusion that the origin of life can be attributed to a lucky chance. If that's the best argument you've got, then the game is over, said Anthony Flew, and I had to follow the evidence where it led. So you see the power of this kind of design argument if it's something that's going to move someone who's made his name and career as a defender of atheism over to at least belief in some kind of a creator. So if we'd looked at the fine-tuning of the universe, you'd see how this argument parallels the way that you can structure an argument for the fine-tuning of the universe, which again, we were talking about, would DNA be an example of local fine-tuning? And you're saying, yes, really, this kind of informational complexity or specified complexity. I think my couple of illustrations, I love you need concrete illustrations to bring these kind of things home. If you're playing the English game of Scrabble, where you make words out of the tiles with different letters on them, when you draw those letters out from the Scrabble bag, sight unseen, so you have a random drawing of letters, you can draw out a long, random gobbledygook word that means nothing, and very easily avoid explaining that arrangement of letters in terms of invoking intelligence. Of course, it's random luck, chance. You can even occasionally draw out a short word that conforms to the independently known, the independently specified rules of the grammar of a particular language. You might draw out the tiles G, O, D. I've drawn out the word God from my Scrabble bag. But you can still avoid, rationally, having to invoke design or intelligence to explain that. You say, it's just lucky. Occasionally you will draw out a specified but not particularly complex arrangement. But if you were like in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where they get the Scrabble tiles and they draw out the Scrabble tiles at random and they start spelling out, the answer to the question of life, the universe, and everything is... Well, in that situation, you'd think someone was pulling a magic trick on you. It's a set-up job. There's somehow, however it's implemented, there's design going on. Bill Craig says, the Cowboys playing poker in Dodge City. And all of the other cowboys notice that every time Slim Jim is the cowboy who deals the cards, he ends up winning the poker game with a straight flush. And this keeps happening. And eventually they get a little bit suspicious of Slim Jim. And they pull their six-shooters on him and demand that he explain himself because they reckon he's a cheating varmint. And Slim Jim says, look, any hand of cards that I get dealt is just as unlikely just as complicated as any other hand of cards. It's one arrangement of n number of cards out of all the possible arrangements of n number of cards length. So any hand of cards is just as unlikely as any other. Don't know what you're getting your knickers in a twist for. I'm just lucky. And Bill Craig says those cowboys are not going to take that explanation lying down, and Slim Jim is going to end up with a belly full of lead. Because it's the coincidence of highly complex pattern with an independently known specifiable pattern, like that's the pattern you need to win the game every time. Or when you put a card in a hole in the ward machine and punch in 4 digits and I get money out of it, was I lucky? Or is the better explanation that I knew the 4 digits that are the 4 digits that specify my bank account? Of course, any 4-digit number I enter in there is highly complex. That's like the fine-tuning of the universe. The highly complex laws that exist happen to be the ones that allow life to exist, whereas most sets wouldn't. And again, similarly in DNA, things exhibiting this kind of specified complexity in our experience are probably designed, and life capable of evolving. Before we even get to evolution, life depends upon the specified complexity of functional information embedded in genetic and epigenetic biological structures. So that points positively. It's not merely that it's a lacuna of explanation that naturalists are now openly admitting that they have problems with explaining the origin of life, that it's a gap that's opening. It's not just that there's a lack of a non-design explanation, but that there's a positive indicator of design that is in those clips Stephen Meyer points out, as he points out in his recent book, Darwin's Doubt, uses the same scientific methodology as Charles Darwin used in The Origin of Species, which he took from Lyell, of explaining things in terms of best explanation arguments, explaining data in terms of what in our experience do we know has the causal power to produce this effect. And so he argues, I use the same scientific methodology as Darwin to point to the opposite conclusion, which is a canny way of proceeding. So that's a sort of summary on the intelligent design element that the program covers. Yeah. It's what Paul Davies famously wrote a book called The Goldilocks Enigma. The Goldilocks Enigma, why is Earth just right for life? And you may have heard in the news, and you often get inflated accounts in the popular press about the current search for extraterrestrial planets and the ongoing search for even Earth-like planets. And each new vaguely Earth-like planet that is discovered is then reported in the newspapers as, we'll all be going on holiday to Alpha Centauri by the end of the decade kind of thing. But they get really excited if they find a planet that might be solid, that possibly is in the right distance from its star so that it could have liquid water on it if there is the right kind of atmosphere there, which we don't know. And then that gets reported as new Earth discovered. Pack your bags. Now, what it seems to me is that thus far we've discovered a lot of extraterrestrial planets, all of which are not Earth-like. So does that mean that the statistics, I'm going to this with a mathematician, does that mean the statistics on the likelihood of other Earth-like planets goes up, because we've shown at least that it's possible for there to be other planets, other solar systems and so on, or does it mean going down because our sample size of non-Earth-like planets keeps increasing? That's an interesting conundrum to go into. So again, and I really recommend this book to you by Bradley Monton, Seeking God in Science. An atheist defends intelligent design. And he says this towards the end of the book. He says, intelligent design needs to be taken more seriously than a lot of its opponents are willing to do. The arguments do have some force. They make me less certain of my atheism than I would have been had I not heard the arguments. I think there is some evidence for an intelligent designer, and in fact, I think there is some evidence that the intelligent designer is God, because of course those are separable questions. Now, Monton remains an atheist. He thinks he has reasons for atheism that sufficiently overbalance the evidence from design, that there is design and that the best explanation of that is theistic. But here is an atheist philosopher of science willing to say, look guys, there's something to this, and it does make me less certain of my atheism than I would otherwise be. And that's really interesting to see.